My son texted me at 9:17 on a quiet Tuesday morning. Dad said she's moving in this weekend. And that was how I found out my husband of 41 years had decided to replace me in the home I helped build. I read the message twice before I set my phone down on the granite kitchen island Richard insisted on importing from Italy 15 years ago. Back when he still said things like "this house will hold our grandchildren one day," and meant it. The morning light was coming through the tall windows facing the maple trees in our front yard. The same trees we planted when Daniel was in elementary school. And everything looked so painfully normal that it almost felt like a mistake. I poured myself a cup of coffee, measured exactly 1 tablespoon of cream the way I always do, and sat down at the long oak table where I had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for decades. Richard hadn't texted me himself. He had chosen to let our son deliver the news, as if I were a tenant being notified about a change in management. "She is moving in." Not "we need to talk." Not "I made a mistake." Just a quiet announcement of displacement. I did not cry. I did not call him. Instead, I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator where I keep important documents and took out the folder labeled property deed. The house is valued at just over $5 million, according to the last appraisal. A sprawling white colonial in Greenwich with 6 bedrooms, a slate roof, and a backyard that slopes gently toward a line of old stone fencing. I remember standing on that empty lot at 30 years old, holding blueprints in my hands while Richard described where his future office would be. I remember signing the initial mortgage papers when interest rates were high and money was tight, promising myself that sacrifice was temporary but security would last. For 41 years, I hosted charity luncheons in that dining room, polished silver before Christmas Eve dinners, and chose every light fixture with careful thought. I built more than walls there. I built a life. Daniel's text buzzed again. "Mom? Are you okay?" I typed back 3 words. "I'm perfectly fine." It was not anger that settled over me. It was clarity. Richard had been distant for months, leaving early, coming home late, claiming business dinners and out-of-town meetings that required freshly pressed suits and a new cologne I never bought. I noticed, of course. Women married for decades always notice. But I also believed in patience, in privacy, in handling things quietly. Now, apparently, quiet was no longer an option. "She is moving in." The audacity of the sentence was almost impressive. I stood up and walked through the foyer, past the curved staircase and the family portraits lining the wall. There we were at Daniel's college graduation. There we were on our 25th anniversary trip to Napa Valley. There we were smiling in front of the very front door that would soon open to a stranger carrying suitcases. I paused in the doorway of the master bedroom and looked at the king-sized bed where Richard and I had slept for 4 decades. The room smelled faintly of the lavender spray I use on the sheets. His side of the closet was half empty. That explained the garment bag. I reached for my phone and finally called him. It went straight to voicemail. I did not leave a message. Instead, I called Michael Reynolds, our estate attorney for the past 20 years. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn," he said, his voice cautious. "I need to review the deed on the house," I replied. There was a pause. "Is everything all right?" "That depends," I said calmly, "on whether I still have options." I returned to the kitchen and sat down again, the coffee now lukewarm in my cup. Outside, a delivery truck drove past. Ordinary life continuing as if nothing monumental had shifted inside these walls. "She is moving in." Richard must have believed I would pack a suitcase quietly, retreat to a condo somewhere, and allow him to rewrite our history as if I were a footnote. He forgot something essential. My name is on that deed. My signature helped secure every refinancing, every equity line, every expansion. I was not a guest in that house. I was its foundation. And foundations do not move simply because someone announces a change of decor. I picked up the deed and read every line slowly. The legal language steady and unemotional. Joint tenancy. Survivorship. Transfer rights. Words that once felt like formalities now felt like tools. Daniel's message remained on my screen, the timestamp glaring back at me. 9:17 a.m. By 9:42 a.m., I had decided something else entirely. If Richard believed he could install a new chapter in my home without consulting the woman who built it beside him, then he had underestimated me in the most expensive way possible. Michael asked me to come into his office that afternoon. And I agreed without hesitation because there are moments in life when hesitation costs more than decisiveness. I changed out of my linen house blouse into a navy wool blazer, applied a light layer of lipstick, and drove the familiar 22 minutes to his firm on Elm Street. The drive felt strangely peaceful. The sun was bright, traffic moved steadily, and the world outside my windshield appeared indifferent to the quiet shift happening inside my marriage. I parked in my usual spot near the corner and walked into the building where I had signed countless documents beside Richard over the years: charitable foundations, refinancing agreements, trust updates. The receptionist greeted me by name, which reminded me of something important. I was not invisible. Michael closed the door to his office once I sat down. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply placed a copy of the property deed in front of me and adjusted his glasses. "The house is held in joint tenancy," he said carefully. "That means both signatures matter for a sale under normal circumstances." I folded my hands on the desk and asked him to explain the exceptions. He looked at me for a long moment before responding. "If one party initiates a transfer before a divorce filing and certain timing conditions are met, there are options." Options. The word settled into the air between us like a steady heartbeat. I asked him how quickly a transfer could be executed if I chose to move forward. He replied that with proper documentation and a willing buyer, it could be done within 48 hours. 48 hours. That was less time than Richard had likely spent planning to rearrange our bedroom furniture for someone else. I nodded once. Then I asked a second question. What would happen if the property were sold significantly below market value? Michael's eyebrows lifted slightly. It would still be legal if both parties of the transaction agreed, and the paperwork was clean. There might be tax implications, but legality would not be the issue. I thanked him for his clarity. I did not mention Vanessa's name. I did not describe the text message. I did not need to. The details were irrelevant. What mattered was ownership and timing. When I stepped back out into the hallway, my reflection in the polished glass doors looked calm, almost serene. I drove home slowly, passing the bakery where I used to buy Daniel chocolate chip cookies after his soccer games, passing the small park where Richard once insisted we take family photographs for a holiday card. Memories lined the route like silent witnesses. By the time I pulled into the circular driveway, my decision had solidified. I walked through the front door and listened to the echo of my heels on the marble floor. The house did not feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like an asset. I went into my study, opened my contact list, and scrolled until I found the name Charlotte Bennett. Charlotte had been my closest friend for more than 30 years. She understood contracts, discretion, and loyalty. When she answered, her voice was warm but alert. I told her I needed a favor that required complete confidentiality. She did not hesitate. She simply said, "Tell me what you need." I explained the situation in measured sentences, omitting drama and focusing only on facts. "Richard intends to move another woman into the house. I intend to ensure that does not happen." There was silence on the line, then a quiet exhale. "What are you thinking, Evelyn?" I looked around the study at the built-in shelves Richard once bragged about to his colleagues and said the words without raising my voice. "I am thinking of selling the house." Quickly. The sun had shifted by then, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. In those shadows I saw clearly the woman I had been for decades, accommodating, patient, willing to smooth over discomfort for the sake of family harmony. That woman had served her purpose. Now precision would serve me better. I ended the call with Charlotte and walked upstairs one more time, running my fingers lightly along the banister we had chosen together. I did not feel bitterness. I felt resolve. Richard believed he was rearranging his future. He had not considered that I might rearrange it first. I slept in the guest room that night, not because Richard asked me to, but because I wanted to. Feel the house from a different angle, as if I were already a visitor studying it before departure. The mattress in that room was firmer, the window smaller, the view limited to the side yard where the hydrangeas bloom every June. I lay awake listening to the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the faint ticking of the hallway clock, sounds I had ignored for decades. When you remove expectation from a space, you begin to hear it differently. At 6:30 the next morning I rose, made the bed with deliberate precision, and dressed in a soft gray sweater and tailored slacks. I did not check my phone immediately. I did not want my first thought to belong to someone else. Instead, I walked through the house slowly, taking inventory not of memories but of structure. The crown molding we had argued about the cost of. The French doors that open onto the patio. The built-in wine cabinet Richard rarely used but proudly displayed to guests. Each detail represented equity, not sentiment. At 8:15 my phone vibrated. It was Daniel again. "Mom, Dad says you are not answering his calls," I replied. "I am handling something important." I did not elaborate. I brewed fresh coffee and sat at the kitchen island with my laptop open, reviewing comparable sales in our neighborhood. $5 million was a conservative estimate. In the past 12 months, 2 properties on our street had closed at even higher numbers. The market was strong. The timing, ironically, was perfect. Charlotte arrived just before 10 o'clock, wearing a cream coat and carrying a leather folder. She stepped into the foyer and paused, her eyes sweeping the staircase and chandelier with quiet understanding. "Are you certain?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. We sat in my study, the same room where I once helped Daniel fill out college applications. I explained the structure Michael had outlined. The transfer would be immediate, clean, irreversible. Charlotte listened without interruption, then opened her folder and placed a blank purchase agreement on the desk. "If we do this," she said, "we do it correctly." I nodded. There would be no chaos. No scene. Just signatures. I set a nominal price on the document. $100. The number looked almost absurd against the backdrop of a $5 million valuation, but legality does not measure emotion. It measures consent. Charlotte would hold the property temporarily, long enough to ensure that Richard's weekend plans dissolved before they began. We reviewed every clause carefully. I initialed each page with steady handwriting. My pulse did not race. My hands did not tremble. After decades of compromise, clarity feels surprisingly calm. By noon, the paperwork was complete pending notarization. I changed into a navy coat and drove with Charlotte to a notary office downtown. The woman behind the counter verified our identification and stamped each page with a firm, echoing press. With each stamp, a chapter closed quietly. When we stepped back outside, the sky had turned a crisp, polished blue. I checked my phone then. 3 missed calls from Richard. 1 voicemail. I listened to it without expression. His voice sounded irritated, not remorseful. He spoke about timing, about logistics, about how I needed to be reasonable. He did not mention 41 years. He did not mention loyalty. I deleted the message. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the transfer was submitted electronically. By 4 o'clock, confirmation arrived in my inbox. The house on Maple Ridge Drive no longer belonged to Richard and me. It belonged to Charlotte Bennett. I stood in the foyer again as the late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows and felt something shift inside my chest. Not grief. Not triumph. Balance. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom one last time and opened the closet door. His remaining suits hung in a neat row, waiting for a future that no longer existed in this address. I closed the door gently. Downstairs my phone rang again. I silenced it. There are moments when silence is more powerful than any argument. By the time Richard would arrive that weekend with a woman who believed she was stepping into a ready-made life, the foundation beneath her expectations would already be gone. Friday arrived with an unusual stillness, the kind that settles over a house before a storm that no one else can see. I woke before sunrise and stood at the bedroom window, watching the faint pink line stretch across the horizon above the maple trees. The closet beside me was half empty, and the silence in the room no longer felt like abandonment. Felt like preparation. Downstairs I made breakfast as I always had, 2 slices of whole grain toast, 1 soft boiled egg, coffee measured precisely. Routine is a powerful thing. It reminds you that you still belong to yourself, even when someone else has decided you no longer belong to them. At 9 o'clock, Charlotte called to confirm that the final recording had been processed through the county clerk's office. The property records now reflected her name. It was official. The house had changed hands quietly, without spectacle, without confrontation. I thanked her and hung up, then began placing a few personal items into a single leather suitcase. I did not pack in a hurry. I chose deliberately. A framed photograph of Daniel at 10 years old holding up a science fair ribbon. The pearl necklace my mother gave me on my wedding day. A small silver tray engraved with our initials that no longer felt shared. The rest could remain. By noon, Richard sent a message stating that he would be arriving around 4 o'clock. He added that we needed to discuss living arrangements. I read the words carefully. Living arrangements. As if I were a guest whose reservation had expired. I did not respond. Instead, I walked through the house one final time. Not to mourn it but to release it. The dining room table where I hosted holiday dinners. The library where I once helped Daniel prepare for the SAT. The patio where Richard toasted business victories under string lights. Every room had held my effort, my planning, my labor. Ownership is not always visible in photographs, but it is felt in the quiet details. At 3:45, I heard the distant sound of a vehicle turning into the circular driveway. I stood near the foyer window and watched as a black sport utility vehicle rolled to a stop. A moving truck followed behind it, white and anonymous. Richard stepped out first, adjusting his jacket as if arriving at a business meeting. A woman exited from the passenger side, her hair styled carefully, her posture confident. She glanced at the house with what looked like anticipation. I did not step outside. I did not announce myself. Instead, I remained still as Richard approached the front door and inserted his key. He turned it once, then twice. The lock did not yield. He paused, confused, and tried again with more force. The door remained closed. I could see the slight tension in his shoulders even through the glass. He stepped back and looked at the number beside the entryway as if verifying the address. The woman said something I could not hear. Richard took out his phone and dialed my number. I let it ring. Moments later, another car pulled into the driveway. Charlotte stepped out, composed and professional, holding a folder beneath her arm. She approached Richard with the calm assurance of someone who understood exactly what was unfolding. I watched through the window as she introduced herself and handed him a copy of the recorded deed. His expression shifted slowly from irritation to disbelief. He scanned the document, then looked at the house again as though it might contradict the paper in his hands. It did not. The woman beside him grew noticeably quieter. The moving truck driver remained seated, uncertain. Richard dialed my number again. This time I answered. His voice was tight, demanding explanations. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I spoke evenly. I told him the house had been sold in accordance with the law. I told him arrangements could be made for his remaining belongings to be delivered to a location of his choosing. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. Silence followed on the line, heavy and unfamiliar. Through the window, I saw him lower his phone slowly, staring at the front door as if it had betrayed him. In truth, the door had simply honored the signature that built it. I ended the call and closed the curtains gently. The house was no longer mine to protect. And it was certainly no longer his to rearrange. I picked up my suitcase, walked out through the side entrance, and left without looking back. Some foundations are invisible, but when they shift, the entire structure must adjust. By the time I reached the townhouse I had arranged earlier that week, the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft amber glow over the quiet row of brick facades. The property was modest compared to the colonial I had just left, 2 bedrooms, 1 small study, and a compact kitchen with white cabinets and brushed nickel handles. It was not grand, but it was entirely mine. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and placed my suitcase carefully on the hardwood floor. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. I did not turn on the television. I did not check social media. I walked slowly through each room, adjusting the blinds, opening a window to let in the cool Connecticut evening breeze. There is a particular calm that comes from choosing your own direction, even if that direction leads to smaller square footage and fewer chandeliers. My phone rang just after 7 o'clock. It was Daniel. His voice carried confusion and something close to disbelief. He asked if what his father told him was true. I confirmed it in a steady tone. The house had been sold. The decision had been legal and deliberate. There was a pause on the line long enough for me to hear him exhale. He asked why I had not warned him. I told him gently that sometimes protection requires silence. I reminded him that I had spent decades protecting our family's stability without public displays or dramatic confrontations. This was no different. He did not argue. Instead, he asked where I was staying. I told him I was safe and comfortable. He said he would come by the next day. After we ended the call, I sat at the small dining table in the townhouse and allowed the quiet to settle around me. No echoes. No cavernous ceilings. Just the steady hum of a refrigerator, and the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking once before falling silent. I felt lighter not because I had lost something, but because I had released something that no longer honored me. Later that evening, Richard attempted to call again. I let it ring until it stopped. He sent a message accusing me of impulsiveness. I read it carefully. Impulsive decisions are loud and chaotic. This had been neither. This had been calculated and clean. The next morning, I drove back to Maple Ridge Drive briefly, not to reclaim anything, but to retrieve a final box Charlotte had set aside for me. The moving truck was gone. The driveway looked empty and unfamiliar. Charlotte greeted me at the door with a firm nod. She informed me that Richard had contacted an attorney, but the paperwork was airtight. There would be no reversal. As I carried the small box back to my car, I noticed the hydrangeas in the side yard, their blue blossoms steady and unchanged. Nature does not adjust its course because human expectations collapse. It continues. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at the townhouse. He stood in the doorway, scanning the modest living room with visible concern. I offered him coffee in a simple ceramic mug rather than the crystal cups he was used to seeing at the old house. He asked if I was truly content with this arrangement. I told him that contentment does not come from square footage. Comes from self-respect. He looked down at his hands for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He admitted that his father had underestimated me. I did not smile. I simply told him that underestimation can be very expensive. When he left, I closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the quiet once more. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no scenes. Only a shift in ownership and a recalibration of dignity. That evening, as I unpacked the framed photograph of Daniel holding his science fair ribbon, I placed it on the small mantel in the townhouse living room. Fit perfectly. I realized then that space adapts to the woman who inhabits it. Grandeur is optional. Self-possession is not. Richard had believed he was stepping into a new chapter by rearranging furniture and addresses. He had not anticipated that I would rewrite the setting entirely. And in doing so, I did not destroy anything. I simply ensured that what I built could not be taken from me without consequence. The first week in the townhouse passed with a kind of quiet discipline I had not experienced in years. I woke each morning at 6:30, opened the kitchen window an inch to let in the cool coastal air, and brewed coffee in a simple stainless steel pot instead of the oversized machine that once dominated my marble counter. The rituals were smaller now, but they belonged entirely to me. No waiting for a garage door to lift at unpredictable hours. No rehearsed explanations about business dinners that stretched past midnight. Just the steady rhythm of my own decisions. On Monday morning, Michael called to inform me that Richard's attorney had formally requested a review of the transaction. I listened without alarm. The documentation was thorough. The signatures were clear. The recording with the county clerk was complete. Legal challenges require leverage, and Richard had none. After the call ended, I set my phone down and watered the small potted fern I had placed by the living room window. Control is not loud. It is consistent. By Wednesday, news had begun circulating quietly within our social circle. Greenwich is elegant, but it is not discreet. A $5 million property changing ownership for $100 does not go unnoticed for long. Charlotte handled inquiries with professional calm. She confirmed that the sale was intentional and private. I did not attend any luncheons that week. I did not answer speculative messages. Silence again served me better than explanation. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel visited unexpectedly. He looked tired, older than his 38 years. He sat across from me at the small dining table, and admitted that his father had been staying temporarily in a corporate apartment downtown. The woman who had been prepared to move into Maple Ridge Drive had not followed through once she understood the house was no longer available. I absorbed this information without visible reaction. I did not ask for details. I did not need them. Daniel studied my face as if searching for bitterness. Instead, he found composure. He asked if I felt any regret. I told him regret belongs to actions taken in anger. This was taken in clarity. He nodded slowly and confessed that he had always assumed the house was primarily his father's achievement. I corrected him gently. Achievement is rarely singular in a marriage that spans 4 decades. I reminded him of the years I managed renovation budgets, negotiated contractor disputes, and refinanced during economic downturns so that equity would continue to grow. Foundations are rarely photographed, but they carry the weight. Later that evening, I reviewed my own finances carefully. With the proceeds from the broader estate structure and long-term investments I had quietly maintained, I was secure. The townhouse was not a retreat. It was a recalibration. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor to restructure assets under my sole discretion. Independence requires maintenance just like property. On Friday morning, Richard finally left a message that did not carry irritation. It carried something closer to disbelief. He said he never imagined I would go that far. I replayed the message once, then deleted it. Far is a relative term. For decades, I had adjusted my expectations quietly to accommodate his ambitions. This was the first time I adjusted reality to accommodate my own. That afternoon I walked through the local farmer's market 2 blocks from the townhouse, selecting fresh peaches and a loaf of sourdough bread. No one recognized me as the woman who once hosted holiday galas under crystal chandeliers. I was simply another resident carrying a canvas bag. There was relief in that anonymity. That evening, as I arranged the peaches in a simple ceramic bowl on my small kitchen counter, I considered the difference between ownership and attachment. The colonial house had been both. Now it was neither. What remained was steadier. Self-possession does not require square footage or grand staircases. It requires clarity about what you will and will not tolerate. Richard had believed that introducing a new presence into our shared home would quietly displace me. Instead, it displaced him. Not through confrontation, not through scandal, through paperwork and timing. I turned off the kitchen light before bed and stood for a moment in the dim hallway of the townhouse. The walls were plain. The ceilings were modest. The air was still. And for the first time in many years, the quiet did not feel like something I was enduring. It felt like something I had chosen. By the second week in the townhouse, the rhythm of my days had settled into something deliberate and unhurried. I arranged my mornings around light rather than obligation, opening the curtains just enough to let the early sun warm the living room floor. The townhouse faced east, and at 7 o'clock the light would stretch across the hardwood in a long pale stripe, steady and predictable. Predictability is underrated. It does not excite, but it stabilizes. Richard sent no messages for several days. That silence was not accidental. It was strategic, the kind of pause people use when they expect you to feel the absence. I did not. Instead, I reviewed paperwork related to the broader estate, consolidating accounts, adjusting beneficiaries, and ensuring that no decision of mine would again depend on someone who treated partnership as convenience. Daniel called midweek to inform me that his father had moved his belongings into storage. There was a certain finality in that detail. Storage units are not homes. They are transitions. I listened without commentary and asked Daniel about his work, about whether he was sleeping well. When families fracture, it is rarely clean. There are emotional aftershocks that ripple quietly through the next generation. I refused to let him become collateral damage in a conflict he did not initiate. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Richard's attorney proposing a meeting to discuss division of remaining shared assets. The tone was restrained, formal, respectful. It was a different tone than the voicemail he had left days earlier. Circumstances adjust language. I responded that I would attend with counsel present, and that all communication should proceed through proper channels. There would be no kitchen table negotiations, no emotional appeals framed as reconciliation. The following morning, I walked 2 blocks to a small cafe near the harbor and ordered tea instead of coffee. The water beyond the docks moved in soft, repetitive waves, indifferent to personal upheaval. I thought about the decades I spent anticipating Richard's needs before my own, anticipating business shifts, anticipating social obligations, anticipating moods. Anticipation is exhausting when it flows in one direction. For the first time in many years, I felt no need to predict anyone else's reaction. Charlotte stopped by that evening with documents confirming that the utilities for Maple Ridge Drive had been transferred fully into her name. The house was already undergoing minor renovations, nothing drastic, just fresh paint and refinished floors. Hearing that did not sting. It affirmed something essential. Spaces evolve. People must as well. Daniel visited again that weekend, bringing groceries and insisting on installing additional shelves in my study. I watched him measure the wall carefully, his movements deliberate, perhaps influenced by the events he had witnessed. I ironed a charcoal gray suit and placed it neatly on the closet door. The townhouse bedroom was modest, the ceiling lower than the vaulted one I had left behind, but it held something the larger room never did: certainty. As I turned off the bedside lamp, I reflected on the sequence of events that had brought me here. There had been no shouting, no spectacle, no public unraveling. Only signatures, timing, and resolve. Some people believe strength must be loud to be effective. I have learned that the most lasting shifts happen quietly, often before anyone else understands that the ground has already moved. The meeting took place on a gray Tuesday morning in a conference room that smelled faintly of polished wood and strong coffee. I arrived 5 minutes early, wearing the charcoal gray suit I had pressed the night before and carrying a slim leather folder that held copies of every document I might need. Michael sat beside me, calm and methodical as always. Across the table, Richard looked older than I remembered, not physically diminished, but unsettled in a way that money does not easily fix. He avoided my eyes at first, focusing instead on the neat stack of papers in front of him. The attorney began outlining the purpose of the meeting, speaking in neutral language about asset distribution and final arrangements. The tone was professional, almost detached, which suited me. I had no interest in revisiting history for the sake of sentiment. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was controlled but edged with disbelief. He said he never expected me to act so decisively. I listened without interrupting. Then I responded with a simple truth. Decisiveness becomes necessary when communication fails. There was no anger in my tone, only clarity. He attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, suggesting that he had assumed we would discuss the transition before any formal action occurred. I reminded him gently that announcements delivered through third parties are not discussions. They are declarations. Silence followed. The attorneys continued reviewing figures, retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and the division of art and furnishings acquired over 4 decades. I requested only what was legally mine and declined any items tied more to memory than value. Possessions can become emotional traps if you allow them to. I chose efficiency instead. By the end of the meeting, the outline of our separation was nearly complete. There would be no public spectacle, no drawn-out litigation. The paperwork would proceed in stages, each step documented and orderly. As we stood to leave, Richard finally met my gaze. For a brief moment I saw recognition there, not of loss but of miscalculation. He had underestimated the woman who had stood beside him in every negotiation, every refinancing, every expansion. He had mistaken patience for passivity. That error had reshaped his circumstances more effectively than any argument ever could. Outside the building, the air was crisp and cool. I walked toward my car without looking back. The harbor was visible at the end of the street, its surface steady despite the wind. Later that afternoon, Daniel called to ask how the meeting had gone. I told him it had been productive. He hesitated before asking whether I felt any sadness. I considered the question carefully. Sadness implies surprise. I had not been surprised. I had been prepared. That distinction matters. Over the next several days, final documents circulated electronically. I signed each one with measured attention, reviewing every clause before placing my name on the line. A signature is not merely ink. It is consent. I gave mine only where it served my stability. Word reached me through mutual acquaintances that Richard had begun speaking publicly about a new chapter in his life, about fresh starts and unexpected changes. I did not respond. Reinvention often sounds confident when described from a distance. It feels very different when grounded in consequence. One evening, as I arranged fresh flowers on the small dining table in the townhouse, I realized something quiet but profound. I no longer anticipated his schedule, his reactions, his needs. My days unfolded according to my own pace. The townhouse walls, once unfamiliar, now felt steady and intentional. The modest scale of the rooms no longer registered as smaller. They felt sufficient. Independence rarely announces itself with fireworks. It settles gradually like light filling a space at dawn. By the end of that week, the legal separation was in motion, structured and contained. There had been no raised voices, no public unraveling, only choices made with precision. As I turned off the kitchen light that night, I understood that the most significant shift had not been the transfer of property or the division of assets. It had been the recalibration of power. I had not acted out of revenge. I had acted out of recognition. And recognition, once awakened, does not return quietly to sleep. Several months passed with the quiet steadiness of a season changing without announcement. The legal separation finalized without spectacle, each document filed, each account adjusted, each signature placed with deliberate care. I remained in the townhouse, refining it slowly, replacing standard light fixtures with softer ones, planting white hydrangeas and narrow planters along the front steps. The scale of my life had shifted, but its quality had not diminished. If anything, it had sharpened. I no longer scheduled my days around anticipation of someone else's arrival or absence. I no longer evaluated my words for the sake of preserving comfort that was not extended to me in return. Daniel visited regularly, sometimes for dinner, sometimes simply to sit in the quiet living room and speak about ordinary things. Our conversations grew steadier. He asked fewer questions about what had happened and more about what I intended to do next. That question mattered more. I enrolled in a small investment seminar at the community center, not because I lacked knowledge, but because I valued continuous awareness. I joined a local harbor walking group that met twice a week at sunrise. The ocean air at 6:30 in the morning carries a kind of honesty that mirrors rarely do. One afternoon, I received a brief message from Richard. It was not accusatory this time. It was reflective. He said he had underestimated the depth of my involvement in our shared life, that he had confused quiet competence with dependency. I read the message carefully and set the phone down without replying. Acknowledgement, while useful, does not reverse consequence. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his new chapter had grown quieter than anticipated. Ambition often thrives in anticipation but struggles in accountability. I did not take pleasure in that knowledge. I simply recognized it as evidence of gravity returning to its proper direction. Charlotte eventually transferred the Maple Ridge property to a buyer at full market value. The transaction handled efficiently and without drama. She invited me to see the renovations once completed. I declined. The house had served its purpose in my life. Revisiting it would not alter what had been learned within its walls. Instead, I focused on refining what lay ahead. I reorganized my estate plan with Michael, ensuring clarity for Daniel and eliminating any ambiguity that might invite confusion in the future. Precision is a gift to those who come after you. One evening, as I sat on the small back patio of the townhouse watching the sun lower itself behind neighboring rooftops, I considered the arc of the past year. There had been no shouting, no public unraveling, no spectacle designed to humiliate. There had been only recognition, decision, and execution. Some people interpret restraint as weakness. I have learned that restraint, when paired with timing, becomes strategy. I had not acted to destroy anything. I had acted to preserve what remained intact within me. Independence is not loud. It does not demand applause. It reveals itself in small moments, in the way you sleep without waiting for a door to open, in the way you arrange flowers without seeking approval, in the way your signature carries authority because it reflects intention rather than reaction. Daniel once asked whether I would ever consider remarrying. I told him that companionship is welcome, but never again at the expense of self-possession. He smiled at that, perhaps understanding for the first time that stability begins internally. As the months continued, my life grew neither extravagant nor diminished. It grew aligned. The townhouse became more than a temporary refuge. It became evidence that scale does not define stature. What defines it is the willingness to stand still long enough to recognize when something essential has shifted, and then to move with precision rather than panic. I once built a foundation beside a man who believed he was the architect. When the structure tilted, I did not collapse beneath it. I adjusted the ground. And in doing so, I discovered that the strongest houses are not the ones with the highest ceilings. They are the ones built on clarity,